When the German armies encircled Leningrad in September 1941, few could have imagined that this city would become the site of the most prolonged and lethal human catastrophe of World War II. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. No single breakthrough, no decisive clash of armies, but a slow, grinding descent into mass death that unfolded day after day, month after month. From the very beginning, the intention was clear. Leningrad was not meant to be captured. It was meant to be erased. Cut off from the outside world, stripped of food, fuel, and hope, the city was sealed behind tightening lines of artillery and blockades. Within weeks, supplies collapsed. Bread rations fell to levels barely sufficient to keep a human body alive. By winter, starvation was no longer an abstract threat, but a daily reality that shaped every decision. People queued for hours in freezing temperatures for pieces of bread weighed in grams. Factories continued operating even as workers collapsed at their machines. Trams stopped running because conductors no longer had the strength to stand. Bodies appeared in stairwells, on sidewalks, and in apartments where entire families had quietly died overnight. Unlike the sudden violence of battlefield annihilation, Leningrad's suffering was methodical, sustained, and unrelenting, turning civilian existence itself into a form of combat. As the siege tightened, the distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved almost completely. The city's population was mobilized not only to fight, but simply to endure. Children dug trenches. Elderly residents hauled the dead on sleds through snow-covered streets. Hospitals functioned without heat, electricity, or adequate medicine, treating patients weakened beyond recovery. Hunger became the dominant force shaping life inside the city, affecting judgment, morality, and survival itself. Reports from the time describe people boiling wallpaper paste, leather belts, and sawdust to create something resembling nourishment. Cases of cannibalism, once unthinkable, began to surface, not as acts of cruelty, but as desperate attempts to stay alive. Meanwhile, German artillery continued to shell residential districts, warehouses, and food depots, ensuring that even limited supplies were destroyed. Air raids targeted infrastructure rather than military formations, deepening the collapse of daily life. Despite this, the city did not surrender. Factories continued to produce weapons. Defensive lines were maintained by soldiers who were themselves starving. The frozen Lake Ladoga became a fragile lifeline, crossed by trucks under constant fire to bring in minimal supplies and evacuate the weakest. Many never made it across. By the end of the first winter alone, hundreds of thousands were dead, not from combat wounds but from starvation, cold, and exhaustion. Leningrad had become something far worse than a battlefield. It had become a place where survival itself was contested every hour, transforming the siege into a form of warfare more lethal than any conventional battlefront of World War II. By 1942, the Siege of Leningrad had settled into a grim rhythm that made survival increasingly unlikely. The initial shock of isolation had passed, but the conditions inside the city continued to deteriorate in ways that no relief effort could fully reverse. Food deliveries across Lake Ladoga increased slightly, yet they remained far below what was required to sustain a population of millions. Bread rations fluctuated but never returned to levels that could support physical labor or long-term health. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, turning minor illnesses into fatal conditions. Typhus and dysentery spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters and hospitals already operating beyond collapse. The winter cold returned with the same brutality as before, but now it struck a population already depleted of strength. Thousands died not during air raids or shelling, but quietly in their beds, unable to rise again. Street cleaning ceased. Bodies lay where they fell until someone with enough energy could move them. The city functioned on exhaustion rather than resilience. Yet, paradoxically, military demands did not ease. Soviet command insisted that production continue. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the front were still manufactured by workers who could barely stand. The defense of Leningrad became inseparable from the destruction of its population, as endurance itself was treated as a military resource to be consumed. The German strategy remained unchanged throughout this period. Leningrad was not stormed, because assault would cost lives on both sides. Starvation was cheaper. Artillery continued to strike residential districts with deliberate regularity, not to break defenses, but to disrupt daily survival. Food warehouses, power stations, and water infrastructure were preferred targets. Each successful strike multiplied the death toll indirectly, as scarcity deepened and recovery became impossible. The longer the siege lasted, the more lethal it became, not through sudden spikes of violence but through accumulation. Death rates remained consistently high month after month, eventually surpassing the casualty figures of even the bloodiest battlefield engagements elsewhere in the war. While battles like Stalingrad produced enormous losses in concentrated bursts, Leningrad consumed human life continuously. Entire neighborhoods disappeared without ever seeing combat. Children died before they could grow strong enough to work or fight. The elderly faded first, followed by the sick, then the young, and finally those once considered healthy. Survival depended less on bravery than on chance. Proximity to food distribution points, access to warmth, or the ability to secure a place on an evacuation convoy. By the end of 1942, it was clear that the siege had transformed into something historically unprecedented. It was no longer a military operation aimed at defeating an enemy force. It had become a sustained process of mass death, unfolding in slow motion, reshaping the very definition of what a battle could mean in World War II. By 1943, the Siege of Leningrad had entered a phase where death was no longer shocking, but expected. The population that remained alive had adapted to conditions that would have been fatal under normal circumstances, yet this adaptation came at a terrible cost. Physical strength disappeared almost entirely. People moved slowly, spoke less, and conserved energy for the most basic actions. The city's soundscape changed as well. Fewer trams, fewer conversations, fewer signs of normal life. What replaced them was the constant awareness of loss. Almost every resident had buried someone, often without ceremony, sometimes without knowing where the body had been taken. Mass graves expanded at the edges of the city as cemeteries filled beyond capacity. Even as supply routes improved marginally, the damage inflicted over the previous years could not be undone. Starvation had permanently altered bodies and minds. Survivors suffered from organ failure, psychological trauma, and long-term illness that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the fighting around the city intensified as Soviet forces began pushing to break the encirclement. These offensives came at enormous cost, adding thousands of military casualties to an already staggering civilian death toll. Leningrad was no longer just starving. It was bleeding again, this time from renewed combat layered onto prolonged deprivation. The effort to lift the siege did not bring immediate relief. Each attempt to reopen land corridors triggered fierce resistance, turning surrounding areas into killing zones. Soldiers fighting to reach the city often advanced through terrain littered with frozen bodies from earlier battles. Gains were measured in meters, paid for with lives. Even when narrow supply lines were established, they could not compensate for the devastation already endured. The death rate declined slowly, but the cumulative losses continued to rise, eventually surpassing those of any single battle fought during World War II. This is what ultimately transformed the Siege of Leningrad into the most bloody battle of the war, not a single moment of annihilation, but the sustained convergence of starvation, bombardment, disease, and combat over nearly 900 days. Unlike conventional battles that ended with surrender or retreat, Leningrad's suffering had no clear conclusion. There was no single victory moment for those inside the city, only the gradual realization that survival itself was a form of resistance. When the siege was finally lifted, what remained was a population profoundly altered by prolonged exposure to death. The city had endured at a cost so vast that it defied conventional military accounting. Leningrad had not been defeated, but it had been consumed. Its people turned into both victims and participants in a struggle that blurred the line between civilian life and total war. By this stage, the siege no longer resembled any known form of conflict. It had become a prolonged human catastrophe that forced historians to reconsider what bloodiest truly meant in the context of World War II. When the Siege of Leningrad finally ended in January 1944, the scale of what had occurred could no longer be contained by military language. More than a city had survived, an entire population had been subjected to conditions deliberately designed to destroy it. Conservative estimates place the death toll at over 1 million civilians, with some historians arguing the number was significantly higher when unrecorded deaths are included. These were not casualties of maneuver warfare or failed offensives. They were deaths caused by policy. Hunger, cold, disease, and sustained bombardment had operated together for nearly 900 days, producing a level of continuous mortality unmatched by any single battle of the war. Unlike Stalingrad or Kursk, where violence peaked and then ended, Leningrad's suffering accumulated relentlessly. Each day added another layer of loss, until the distinction between battlefield and home front disappeared entirely. In that sense, the siege redefined what a battle could be. It was not fought for territory alone, but over the physical limits of human endurance. The city did not fall, yet it paid a price greater than most defeated armies. By the time the blockade was lifted, Leningrad had lost a significant portion of its population, its infrastructure lay in ruins, and its survivors carried damage that would last a lifetime. No other engagement of World War II combined duration, civilian loss, and sustained lethal conditions on such a scale. In the decades that followed, historians continued to debate classifications: battle, siege, campaign, but the human reality remained unchanged. The Siege of Leningrad stands apart because it compresses nearly every form of wartime suffering into a single, extended event. Starvation replaced bullets as the primary killer. Time itself became a weapon. The city's survival did not lessen the bloodshed, it prolonged it. This is why Leningrad can be understood as the most bloody battle of World War II, not because it produced the highest single-day casualties, but because it maintained an unbroken chain of death for nearly 2.5 years. The war elsewhere surged and receded. In Leningrad, it simply endured. The legacy of the siege forced a reckoning with the true cost of total war, especially when civilians become deliberate targets. It demonstrated that victory could be achieved without decisive battles, through attrition aimed not at armies, but at populations. Long after the guns fell silent, Leningrad remained a warning etched into history that modern warfare does not always announce its dead in spectacular moments, but can destroy more lives through persistence than through any single act of violence. In that quiet, grinding reality lies the reason the siege still stands unmatched, not just as a tragedy, but as the most lethal sustained battle ever fought during World War II.